Welcome back to Clarkston Lighthouse Guidance. I'm your host today, Chandler Fleming.
And I'm your co-host, Victoria Fleming, and we are therapists and owners of Clarkston Lighthouse Counseling. Welcome to our show, and today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of diagnostic labels.
Yes, for sure.
Diagnostic labels are everywhere. In the medical field, you've got all the diagnostic labels of cancer and HIV positive and just all the various diagnoses. And then at the psychiatric end, we also, major depression, bipolar, the ADHD, just so many labels. And so as we're talking about this, we're looking at that there are benefits and cons to these diagnostic labels. Yeah. What do you see as some of the pros?
Well, I think there definitely are pros, and some of it is, it gives us a common language. There's some understanding in it. It helps us understand, hey, this is what somebody's talking about when they're depressed. Words have meaning, and that helps. Those labels kind of help understand the meaning underneath things. Mm-hmm. And like for referral to somebody else, if I refer somebody to a psychiatrist and say, I think they suffer from major depression, it gives them a picture of what might be going on and what is going on, and kind of sets them in the right direction.
And it's required for insurance purposes. Sure. For there to be that diagnosis. And I think sometimes the diagnosis is just a strong positive, because then there's understanding that comes with it. It's that, aha, this is what's going on. Yeah. Maybe for the mom or dad who's got a child who just cannot seem to get their head in the game at school and keep getting calls, and little Tommy's doing whatever, and it can be very, very frustrating. And they've tried everything, and then finally get that diagnosis of ADHD, and then there's that identification. Okay, this is what it is, and there's that understanding of, that's what's happening, and then that does provide that opportunity for knowing where to go from here, the treatment aspect of it, and often opens the door for a lot of support. Mm-hmm. That perhaps otherwise would not have been available until that diagnostic label was placed on the problem.
Sure.
So
oftentimes I have parents say, are you going to diagnose my kid with something, and what's the ramifications of that? And sometimes that ramification of it is that when you go to school, you do qualify for assistance. When you try to take a specialized test, you can get that assistance. So sometimes that label or that diagnostic label is necessary as a qualifying factor.
And for me, I don't know, I just suddenly remember, when I was pregnant with our son, and I had that terrible rash, just an unbelievable itch, and I had all these people telling me, Victoria, is just poison ivy. And I was like, I've had poison ivy before.
Right.
And it was super frustrating, because I'm doing all the right things, I'm trying to treat it, and it's not working. Well, it turned out I was allergic to our own child. Right. And it was a rash that was from within. So the wrong diagnosis, sure. Poison ivy, led to the wrong understanding and the wrong treatment, and I certainly wasn't getting the same support.
Yeah.
And so it's very important to be able to properly label.
Yeah, and it also tells people that they're not the only one. Mm-hmm. When you give somebody a label, it's like, there's other people who are depressed. There are other people who are anxious. So it's not like you're this strange person out on the side. When there is a label and there's a condition for it, we know, hey, I'm not the only one who behaves this way or feels this way or acts this way.
And in that way it's so important. And so in those ways, and it did become very important as people, mobility increased and people are able to travel from one state to another and from one country to another. Mm-hmm. For those charts to be able to travel with someone and for there to be some identifier that can go with them. But then that leads us into some of the risks that can happen, some of the cons that can come with diagnostic labels. So let's look at the flip side. What are some of the cons?
I love counseling. I'm a counselor, been one for many, many years, but it's a very loose science/art. And one of those issues is that I've worked at enough places and read enough literature to know that diagnosis can be arbitrary and inconsistent. I have many people that I refer to for a particular condition, but everybody they see is that condition. So I know people who specialize in autism or autism spectrum disorder, and everybody they see, even when I don't see any evidence of it, has some sort of autism in their opinion. Mm-hmm. I know somebody who specialized in ADHD, and everybody they saw was ADHD. Well, sometimes that's selection. Sometimes people seek somebody out because they're an expert in that area, but oftentimes that's not the case. I had a doctor who I think was probably bipolar. In every client he saw, he diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Then when we compare,
and we found that to be true also with pharmaceuticals.
Sure.
You get this next great med,
Yep.
And you suddenly have an influx of the diagnosis that fits that medication. You do have to a little bit query, and we talked about the difference in how in Britain.
Sure.
What was the one that you had mentioned?
That a larger percentage of people in Great Britain are diagnosed with bipolar disorder, where a higher percentage are diagnosed with schizophrenia. So they look at the same person, the same symptoms, and they tend to see that diagnosis. And then kind of going back with medications, I've worked in the field long enough to know that when the next great drug comes out, the diagnosis tends to follow that. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that the doctors are getting lots of training on look for these signs, look for these signs, look for these signs. So they're kind of sensitized and see it that way. But then there's a flip side of that where they have to justify their use of medication. So you give somebody a medication that's been FDA approved to use for bipolar disorder. Well, they really don't have bipolar disorder, but the medication works really, really well for the symptoms they have. Mm-hmm. Well, to avoid a lawsuit, you say, well, I'm going to diagnose you with bipolar disorder because I want to give you a bipolar disorder medication.
And the reason we want to point this out is just so that people don't cling so tightly to the label.
Right.
It is a tool. It's not a sentence.
Sure.
And that's kind of segues into the next possible con or risk of it, is how people really can grip onto that diagnostic label. It can traumatize some people. It can cause people to use it as an excuse and be like, we'll see. Mom, it's not my fault. Yep. I have ADHD. I'm never going to make A's. No, that's not. Yes, you have ADHD, but yes, this person may struggle with depression, or yes, this person may even be bipolar, may have a personality disorder, but it's meant to be a tool. And so just to recognize, again, that it's a tool.
Right. And it's not an identity. And I actually had clients say to me, well, I'm a depressive. No, you're a person who suffers with depression. And in the industry, oftentimes you'll hear other therapists refer to my borderline. Well, it's really not a borderline. It's a person who suffers with borderline personality disorder. Mm-hmm. So it's a label for the area of your life that you struggle with, but it's not who you are. It's just a label that goes along with it.
And I think maybe an easier way to look at that would be cancer. I know people who will not share with people that they have cancer because they feel like then everyone who looks at them is cancer.
Yeah.
And it's Susie who happens to have a problem that's labeled or symptoms that are labeled, but that's not who Susie is, and that's what we're trying to differentiate here. So let's take a look at how that can even further display itself in that identification and yet not quite identification by looking at little Susie, Johnny, and Billy.
Sure. So this is kind of just to illustrate the diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is the official diagnosis for most hyperactivity. So, and I think I've used this example before on air, but little Johnny has parents that really never really wanted to say no to him. He pretty much did what he wants, and nobody ever told him no. Well, he appears at school one day, and little Johnny is climbing the walls and won't sit in a seat. He meets criteria. He has enough symptoms that gives him that diagnostic label of ADHD. Little Susie, her parents fight all the time. And because they fight, sometimes she does things that are out of control to get their attention, but also a lot of times she'll just sit there and wonder what's going on at home. She also meets criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity. Mm-hmm. And then there's little Billy. Little Billy's first word was pow. And you know what? Even when he was a baby in the womb, he kicked all the time. He came out screaming and's been screaming and rolling and tumbling ever since. He also meets criteria and would have the label or the diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So we have 3 separate examples, totally different causes, and really the treatment would be quite a bit different. So one of the things I really stress with people is that diagnosis doesn't sometimes even imply a cause. A lot of times it just describes what's going on. It's a description of symptoms. It's not a cause.
And I appreciate that you're clarifying that then also affects the treatment.
Sure.
That because it's a different reason for each one of those diagnoses is going to be a different implementation of treatment. And I think that's something else that happens with labeling sometimes, diagnostic labels, is people have an assumption of, it's this diagnosis, therefore it's this treatment, and that's just not the case.
Right.
You know, and that's where we want to get into the understanding misunderstanding. And many of us are probably familiar with the old story of these blind men are put into a room with an elephant.
Yep.
And these blind men happen to be at a different part of the elephant. There's one man who is at the leg of the elephant, and he feels it, and it's wide, and it feels like a tree. And when he comes out, that's what he says: an elephant is like a tree. You know, there's another man who feels the ear of the elephant, and it's thin, and it's wavy, and it's more like a fan. And so he comes out, and he's like, an elephant is like a fan. You know, the one who got the trunk, and it's long, and you know, an elephant is like a rope, but you know, a really big rope, or a big python snake. And so all 3 of them felt a different part of the
Sure.
elephant, came up with a different description, but it was only a partial. And I think that's what we have to look at with that diagnostic component.
Yeah, really on 2 levels. Diagnosis gives a piece of it, but also to recognize that psychiatry is a really young science. And I will never forget a psychiatrist I was talking to, and he said in one of his presentations, you know, we've identified over 100 chemicals in the brain, and we know a lot about 5 of them. We think they're the important 5 ones, but we know a lot about 5 of them. And we're learning a little bit more about some of the others. So psychiatry and counseling are all very beneficial, but sometimes you got to relax a little bit and kind of be more focused on not necessarily the diagnosis that you're given, and not to overread when you are given a diagnosis, but to really look at more of the outcome and the treatment and really the relationship with your provider.
You know, and for example, regarding the treatment pharmacologically, some of the medications that have been used for depression are now being used for anxiety, and you know, we're finding that Wellbutrin is
Used for everything.
Yes, used just about, isn't
Right,
it?
it's indicated for ADHD, or at least it's used. I don't know if it has FDA indications, but I know lots and lots of physicians that are using Wellbutrin for attention deficit disorder. It's used for anxiety. It's used for depression. It's marketed under the name Chantix, I believe it is, to quit smoking. It's used with some people with addiction. So you have one medication with a variety of different uses.
So again, just that diagnostic labels are not holistic in their approach.
Sure.
You know, it is just an aspect, and that treatments cannot be just immediately plugged in. It's only for this.
Sure.
You know.
You know, and I've had clients before that primarily the family gets a little nervous and said, you know, I think we're going to send them for testing. And I said, you know, I can tell you what the testing is going to say. Well, did you do testing? No, but I can tell you what the testing is going to say. It's going to show that they're moderately depressed and they have mild symptoms of attention deficit disorder. Well, you know what? They come back and they spent $500 or $600, and we're no further along. We have a label, we have certainty in that label, but the vast majority of time, it really doesn't help with the care or the treatment of the client.
Right. And looking at treatment, there's also that facet, like we said, where the danger of becoming the label.
Sure.
And that is a legitimate danger. If someone thinks of themselves as, I'm depressed, and that is their thinking on a regular basis, I'm depressed, I'm depressed, I'm depressed, then the ability, a person can take medication. And if that is their forward thinking, then that medication is not going to be very effective.
Right.
Which is one of the reasons placebos can end up being effective, is a person is thinking so hard that I'm not on the placebo, I'm on the actual chemotherapy, that they show benefit.
Sure.
And so as you're looking at that label, not to be traumatized by it, to remember that it's just addressing the symptoms, the problem, so that you don't get stuck in, and you've talked about it, management versus treatment.
Sure. So management versus treatment is one of the big challenges for anybody who deals with themselves or a family member or even as a therapist. And it's what are the things that we manage? And for the purpose of this exercise, management is things that you do to help the person suffering from an illness to manage their life. So, you know what, if you have a kid who's hyperactive, a good management tool may be you start going to bed a lot earlier because you know the process is going to take time. You may cut down stimulation in the room. You may put them in a quiet room or an appropriate room to do homework. All those things, you're kind of intervening on the behalf of the person to try to manage those things and help things go better. The problem with good management is that the person usually doesn't get better. They don't learn how to master those skills themselves. They just, it's managed for them.
So a balance in that, let's utilize that situation. So initially, perhaps, management would be always isolating for the studying, but then integrating more and more stimuli so that that person becomes adaptive.
Sure.
You know, because the reality is, and there are adults who have ADHD, who have had to learn how to function in the business sector, in hospital settings, in all kinds of places, and have had to learn how to tune out and focus on specific things. So what you're saying is, let's not get so focused on the protecting, on the managing, on being careful, walking on eggshells, because that may irritate the person, and rather maybe initially take extra steps, but then just keep introducing new stimuli, keep introducing so that the person becomes treated, not just managed.
Right, so you have to allow the person to deal with their things. You have to allow them to deal with their symptoms and what's going on, and have them find ways of taking care of it for themselves. The flip side of that is if you're too much on the treatment side, the person can break down. It could be overwhelming. It could be more than the skills that they have. So you got to have that. You have to drive that balance between, hey, these are the things I'm going to manage. So if I suffer from depression, you know, there may be a day I stay in bed all day, and that's kind of managing my life. I'm just going to escape. I'm just going to retreat, and that can be good management for a day or two. But if I'm staying there the whole time, I'm probably not going to get better. So in my own treatment of my depression, it's, you know what, I've got to get up and at least take a shower today. I've got to do these things in order to get better. If I don't exercise, I'm going to feel more tired. It's going to affect my sleep pattern. So,
and it's interesting because really the management becomes I am the label,
yeah.
Whereas the treatment is I am Victoria with a diagnostic label,
right,
who can overcome.
Right, and you got to learn how to overcome. And one of the things that's just kind of moving back, because I really want to stress this point, oftentimes that diagnosis can be traumatizing to people. And I wish this was a made-up story, but I remember seeing this lady about 4 or 5 times, and she was very depressed about being depressed. And on the 5th session, she came in, and she was smiling. I thought, wow, things are going well. And she said, my doctor told me I have cancer. And I said, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. She goes, well, at least I'm not depressed. That's what's causing all this tiredness and lack of motivation. It's cancer. Now, I think she was in a bit of shock, to be honest, but at that moment, she much rather have cancer than have depression.
Because what you're saying is the diagnosis of depression was more traumatizing to her than the diagnosis of the cancer.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, that's amazing. So as we started, there are pros and cons to labels. They're great benefit. It is vital, as we said, for insurance. It can be vital to get the support services that you need in a school system and in different environments. So as we look at this, labels, they are everywhere. And should we use them? So what would be some closing thoughts as we look at this?
Well, I don't even know if the question is, should we use them or not use them? They are used.
Right.
They're out there. And so the challenge is we need to understand them. We need to understand their benefits, and we need to understand
their limits.
Their limits, for sure.
Yeah, they have limits. So really, let's do remember, labels are intended to be an identifier for understanding. Like I said, when I realized that I was allergic to something and it wasn't poison ivy and I was never going to get rid of it through poison ivy treatment, that was an aha, wow, springboard for treatment. And the same is true with any diagnosis. Labels can provide much clarification, and they can help, as we said, the parents who have a child that just can't seem to get their head in the game. It's that gained insight into a situation that can benefit. But we also need to remember that that child is always, the person with the cancer, the person with the depressive disorder is always more than their label.
Yes.
Just as an elephant is more than its tail,
Yep.
or its trunk, or its ears, or its leg.
Yep.
And we want to look at the whole picture. So diagnostic labels are probably here to stay.
Yes.
They're necessary, but let's keep them in perspective.
Definitely. Thank you so much for watching the show. As always, we would love to get your questions from the audience. So check us out on Facebook or our email address. And thank you so much, and send in those questions.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
The views expressed in this show are for general educational purposes only and do not constitute professional advice on any subject matter, nor do they necessarily reflect the views or opinions of its guests or of Independence Television. If mental health assistance is needed, please seek professional licensed treatment.